Ever wondered what would happen if Joe Rogan met Genghis Khan? No? Well, we're discussing it anyway. Picture this, if you will, a modern-day podcast studio filled with all the latest technology suddenly transforms into a time machine. As Joe Rogan, the well-known podcast host, is recording his latest episode, the room starts to shake, the lights flicker, and in a flash of light, a figure appears. And who might that be? None other than Genghis Khan, the fearsome Mongolian ruler from the 13th century. Now, I know what you're thinking. How on earth did Genghis Khan end up in a 21st century podcast studio? Well, that's a question for the ages, isn't it? But for now, let's just roll with it, shall we? So, there they are. Joe Rogan, the modern-day conversationalist, sitting across from Genghis Khan, the man who once ruled over the largest contiguous empire in history. A bit of a clash of cultures, don't you think? Imagine Rogan trying to explain to Genghis what a podcast is. So you see, Genghis, we have these little devices, they're called smartphones, and we record our voices, and then people all around the world can listen to our conversation. And Genghis, in turn, trying to explain the intricacies of his horseback archery techniques. On one hand, we have Rogan, the MMA enthusiast, who's used to discussing everything from comedy to psychedelics, and on the other hand, we have Genghis, a man who's used to, well, conquering. I can't quite decide who'd be more out of their element in this scenario. Would it be Rogan, trying to navigate a conversation with a man from a completely different era and culture? Or would it be Genghis, trying to comprehend the concept of a podcast and the fact that he's sitting in a room filled with strange, futuristic technology? Either way, the resulting conversation would be one for the history books, or should I say, one for the podcast archives. So folks, buckle up and let's dive into the depths of this hilarious time-traveling conversation. Now imagine the language barrier, folks. Genghis Khan speaking in Mongolian and Joe Rogan in 21st century slang. Picture this, if you will. Genghis Khan, the Mongolian warlord, and Joe Rogan, our beloved podcaster, sitting across from each other, each with an interesting tale to tell, but neither understanding a single word the other is saying. It's a bit like trying to explain quantum physics to your pet goldfish, isn't it? Our two protagonists, however, are not ones to be deterred by such minor inconveniences as a language barrier. They resort to the oldest form of communication known to man. No, not smoke signals, but hand gestures. Picture Genghis Khan, the man who conquered half the world, waving his arms about like an overly enthusiastic tour guide. And Joe Rogan trying to decipher the meaning of these exaggerated movements. It's a scene straight out of a comedy sketch, isn't it? Just when you think things can't get any more absurd, they decide to up the ante. They decide to play a game of charades. Now, charades is a game best played with a common cultural background, but when your players are from different millennia, things are bound to get interesting. Joe Rogan miming Fear Factor to a man who literally instilled fear across continents, and Genghis Khan trying to act out a Mongolian horse race to a man whose idea of racing probably involves fast cars, and not so much the equestrian variety. Through this comical game of charades, they start to bridge the gap. They find a way to communicate, to understand each other. Joe Rogan, in a moment of pure genius, or perhaps sheer desperation, decides to teach Genghis Khan the dab. The dab, a dance move that originated in the hip-hop scene and somehow found its way into mainstream culture, being taught to Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire. It's a sight for the ages, folks. And that's how Genghis Khan learned the dab from Joe Rogan, a sight to behold, I'm sure. Ever wondered how a podcast would work in the 13th century? No electricity, no Wi-Fi, no Spotify, just imagine. Now picture this, Joe Rogan, the modern-day podcast maestro, travelling back in time to the 13th century, armed with nothing but his wit and a feather quill. Oh, the hilarity. He'd probably be walking around, trying to find a good spot with the best acoustics, like the town square or maybe a grand cathedral. He'd be muttering to himself, "Where's the best place to drop my podcast?" And, oh, how about recording? No microphones, no sound mixers, no fancy editing software, just a quill, parchment, and the sheer power of his voice. He'd have to shout his thoughts, interviews and philosophies to anyone within earshot. But remember, this is the 13th century, so he'd have to translate his modern musings into Old English or Latin, or maybe even Mongolian if he's trying to interview Genghis Khan. Welcome to the Joe Rogan experience, or as they call it in Latin, Experientia Iosifus Roganus. Today's guest is none other than the mighty Genghis Khan. Genghis, how do you maintain that glorious mane of yours? And imagine the reactions of the locals, confused faces, wide-eyed stares, and probably a few rotten tomatoes thrown his way. And then there's the issue of distribution. No Spotify, no Apple Podcasts, nothing of the sort. He'd have to hire a group of town criers to spread his loudcast around, maybe even get a few monks to transcribe his episodes onto scrolls for posterity. And let's not forget about the live audience. Instead of a quiet recording studio, he'd have an audience of curious peasants, skeptical nobles, and possibly a few angry bishops. A far cry from the controlled environment of his modern podcast studio, but definitely a lot more entertaining. So, next time you're listening to a podcast, spare a thought for our imaginary 13th century Joe Rogan, tirelessly shouting his thoughts into the medieval ether, all in the name of entertainment and enlightenment. And that's how the first loudcast came into existence, folks. Now let's get to the meat of the matter, the interview itself. How does one interview a great Mongolian ruler? Well, if you're Joe Rogan, you'd probably start with the basics. Hey Genghis, how's it going? You got any horse riding tips for us city folk? I heard you Mongolians are born in the saddle, is that true? To which Genghis Khan might reply, horse? What horse? I thought I was riding a very large dog this whole time. Then of course, Rogan, being the fitness enthusiast, would want to know about Genghis's workout routine. So Genghis, how did you stay fit for all those marauding and conquering? Any tips for those of us trying to keep in shape? Genghis might scratch his head and say, conquering workout? I always thought of it as a hobby. But if you want a tip, try running after a herd of yaks. You'll get fit in no time. And then there's the fashion question. Genghis, I've got to ask. Your fur hat. It's always so fluffy. What's your secret? Genghis, fluffing his hat, might just shrug and say, I just use yak butter. Works every time. But let's not forget, Genghis Khan is no ordinary guest. He's got questions of his own. Joe, your head, it's so shiny. How do you do it? Rogan, taken aback, might laugh and say, well, Genghis, it's not yak butter, I can tell you that. And so the interview might go on, back and forth, with Rogan asking about Genghis's lifestyle and Genghis turning the tables with his own curious inquiries. A conversation that spans centuries, cultures, and let's face it, a lot of yak butter. And in return, Genghis Khan asked Rogan about the secret behind his shiny bald head. A fair trade, don't you think? And just like that, a bromance was born between a modern-day podcast host and a 13th century Mongolian ruler. Imagine, if you will, the unlikely duo of Joe Rogan, the master of long-form digital conversation, and Genghis Khan, the infamous leader of the Mongol Empire, striking up a chummy camaraderie. Picture this, the sharp-witted Rogan, clad in his signature black t-shirt, and the legendary Khan, dressed in his imposing battle armor, sharing a chuckle over a bonfire. You see, it all started innocently enough. Rogan, with his ever-curious mind, was intrigued by Khan's tales of conquest and the open steppes. Khan, on the flip side, found Rogan's modern world musings equally captivating. Before you knew it, the pair were planning hunting trips together. Yes, hunting trips. Joe Rogan, the MMA enthusiast, and Genghis Khan, the fearsome warrior, traversing the wilderness, bows and arrows in tow. And let's not forget the podcast. Oh, the podcast. They had a running joke, you see. Genghis Khan would promise to be a guest on Joe's podcast every week. Next week, we'll discuss the secrets of the Great Wall, Khan would declare with a twinkle in his eye. Rogan would chuckle, well aware of the impossibility of this 13th century timeline commitment. But the laughter, the shared stories, and the mutual respect, it was all real. They understood each other, these two men from vastly different eras. And amidst the hilarity of this absurd pairing, a genuine bond of friendship was formed. Yes, it was a bromance for the ages, a connection that transcended time, space, and the constraints of common sense. An MMA commentator and a Mongolian overlord, who would have thought? So there you have it, folks. The most unlikely yet hilarious friendship of all time. Tune in next time when we pair up Elon Musk and Cleopatra. Goodbye and keep laughing.